Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Myers from the Religious Studies Department, newly named, and head of the Center for Jewish Studies here at Duke. This is our third lecture in a continuing series on human rights in the Jewish tradition that will stretch over a 2-year period, culminating with the Rubenstein Library's holdings of the papers and archives of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the noted Jewish theologian and civil rights activist. Together with the Rabbi Marshall T. Meyer holdings, especially his papers regarding his opposition to the dirty war in Argentina and his human rights activities in behalf of the wrongfully imprisoned and disappeared, this collection demonstrates more than words the nobility of the human spirit to act in behalf of others in need at the risk of even their own lives. The organizers of this series believe that human rights is one of the core issues facing the world today, and by examining the Jewish tradition, we hope to show how it can inform and illuminate this important subject. The Center for Jewish Studies and the Center for Human Rights are pleased to join hands with the Religious Studies Department and the Freeman Center in supporting this series. In this academic year, the series focused on 4 main periods of Jewish history, beginning with the biblical period, continuing with the rabbis and the Talmudic period, and today, the medieval period. Our final lecture on the modern period this academic year will be Zachary Brademan of Syracuse University, who will speak here on April 7th and discuss the impact of the Enlightenment on human rights, with particular reference to Moses Mendelssohn and the Jewish Haskalah. And next October, I'm happy to announce Susanna Heschel will talk about her father's legacy on human rights with reference to the civil rights movement, when there will be a soft opening to the Heschel archive in the Rubenstein Library, which is, by the way, running ahead of schedule, I'm happy to announce. And now it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome back to this forum and this building our dear colleague, Professor Emeritus Kalman Bland. Kalman was a professor of religious studies at Duke for many, many decades. He goes back to when I came, and I regard as one of my greatest achievements at Duke University bringing Kalman to Duke from Indiana University. He completed his PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University under the tutelage of his great mentor, Alexander Altman. His major publications, I will mention only 2 books: on medieval Jewish Islamic philosophy, the Epistle on the Possibility of Conjunction with the Active Intellect by Ibn Rushd, with a commentary by Moses Narboni, a critical edition and annotated translation, 1982. I mean, that is real, nighttime reading for most of us. More accessible and a fantastic publication that I refer you to is his The Artless Jew, Medieval and Modern Affirmations and the Denials of the Visual, in 2002, Princeton University Press, which has won great recognition from colleagues here and abroad. Kalman was among our most distinguished colleagues and teachers in the Department of Religion, now Religious Studies. His course on Jewish mysticism was a must for decades of Jewish undergraduates, and I lament its loss to this day. So please welcome back to Duke our colleague Kalman Bland, who will address the subject of the Jewish tradition, human rights in the medieval period.
Thank you, Eric, for making me know for sure that I haven't left. Right? I'm still here. and it's really nice to know that I'm here. And thank you. So you all have a handout, I hope. It's a copy of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If I were not a medievalist, there'd be a PowerPoint. But in the medieval period, we didn't have PowerPoint, so it's a handout. Old-fashioned paper. Okay. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The United Nations was established in October 1945. In 1946, it appointed an 18-member commission charged with crafting a statement of human rights and political ideals. The preamble explains that prominent among the goals of the post-war statement was the prevention of any further disregard and contempt for human rights, which have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. The preamble also proposed a set of civil liberties and socioeconomic measures designed to eliminate the causes of desperation that might lead to violent rebellion against tyranny and oppression. It was hoped that the 18 members of the Commission, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, would succeed in preparing an agenda for improving the world and bringing about a new world in which the dignity of each individual will enjoy secure international protection. The committee labored intensively for 2 years. In December 1948, in Paris, the final draft of its statement was ratified. The tally of votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations was 48 in favor, 8 abstentions, and none opposed. 2 countries, Honduras and Yemen, were absent. The defeated powers of World War II, Germany, which did not join the United Nations until 1973, and Japan, which did not join until 1956, were excluded from the processes of drafting and ratification. The abstaining nations included Belarusia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, USSR, and Yugoslavia, all members of the Soviet bloc, together with Saudi Arabia, which deviated from the consensus of all the other Muslim nations, including Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey, all of whom voted in favor. The timing of the Universal Declaration was therefore decisive. Its content, participants, and pattern of voting were contingent. They were the products of history, the results of expedient diplomatic compromise, achieved against the background of the political, ideological conflict we euphemistically call the Cold War. Remarkably, despite the frigid temperature of post-war belligerence and the intense heat of post-colonial tension, no nation cast a negative vote, perhaps because no nation was being asked to surrender the slightest bit of sovereign jurisdiction to an outside power. Unlike a treaty or a convention, a declaration is merely an exhortation. It lacks the binding force of law. Once ratified, the Declaration began its work of gentle persuasion, inspiring the world's population with visions of post-colonial, perhaps even post-national, post-international, universal utopia. Hence, the deliberately chosen non-threatening title of the document, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but not International Declaration of Human Rights and not Universal Treaty or Convention on Human Rights. The merely advisory utopian vision born in 1948 was nevertheless meant to be realistic. The vision was embodied in a set of 30 articles featuring a list of protections or immunities, things that governments ought not to do to their citizens, and entitlements, actions that governments are expected to take on behalf of their citizens. Today, in 2014, the utopian vision of universal human rights, with its radical list of immunities and entitlements, is still alive but unrealized. In its utopian preamble, the Universal Declaration affirms the Enlightenment's belief in, quote, the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. The preamble also proclaims the Enlightenment's unshakable faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women. Articles 1 and 2 reiterate the secular and egalitarian principles of an Enlightenment political philosophy first articulated in the 17th century by Benedict Spinoza, an excommunicated Jew in Amsterdam, and later developed by his disciples in 18th century Europe, most notably in France. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. To anticipate the end of things, the difference between should and must is decisive. Should act with brotherhood, not must act with brotherhood. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Article 7 declares that all are equal before the law and affirms that all are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration. Article 21 applies these egalitarian principles to the participatory privileges of citizenship. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. Article 21 discloses debts to the more radical version of the Enlightenment originating with Spinoza. It is anti-clerical, forthright in rejecting theocracy. Quote, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. The similarity of United Nations Universal Declaration Article 21 to Article 6 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen ratified by the Revolutionary French National Assembly in 1789 is no coincidence. Slowly we're moving back to the medieval period, now back to 1789. The French version of our shared political ideals declares that, quote, the law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part, in person or by their representatives, in its formation. The law must be the same for everyone. All citizens being equal in its eyes are equally admissible to all public dignities, offices, and employments, according to their ability and with no other distinction than that of their virtues and talents. Hearing these echoes of the French Revolution of 1789 and the American Revolution of 1776 in the Universal Declaration of 1948 reminds us that nothing could be more incompatible with egalitarian democracy or more inimical to the spirit and letter of equal opportunity government of the people, for the people, and by the people than theocracy and rule by absolutist monarchic dynasties. Consider, for example, the Hebrew Bible, the foundational document of Judaism, Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20, to be exact, translated with admirable non-apologetic precision by Robert Alter. Quote, "When you come into the land that the Lord your God is about to give you, and you take hold of it and dwell in it, and you say, 'Let me put a king over me like all the nations that are around me,' you shall surely put a king whom the Lord your God chooses. From the midst of your brothers you shall put a king over you. You shall not be able to set over you a foreign man who is not your brother." Does the textual emphasis on men and brothers suggest that queens might have been permissible? Might a woman be eligible for the royal crown of Israel? Either an ethnic foreign woman or a tribal sister, an Israelite woman. According to the post-biblical authoritative rabbinic understanding of biblical regulations, Jewish women are not eligible for sovereignty. Neither are non-Jewish foreigners, regardless of gender. In a medieval rabbinic text composed by Maimonides, we find one possible reason for excluding non-Jews from occupying the royal throne of Israel. In his Dalalat al-Hayrin, the Arabic original, and the Moreh Nevuchim, its medieval Hebrew translation, or the Guide of the Perplexed, as we know it, that magisterial monument to philosophizing religion, Maimonides offered this opinion. Quote, "For no individual has ever been the chief of a religious community to whose race he did not belong, without doing it great or small injury." To find a possible reason for the exclusion of women, we need temporarily to abandon the philosophy section of the medieval Jewish library and visit the nearby shelf section on law. In the Mishnah Torah, the magisterial monument to regulating religion, the authoritative digest and code of biblical and Talmudic legal traditions, also composed by Maimonides, the law of kings, expanded to include officials and rulers of all sorts, is rendered in fine detail. Quote, "No king is appointed from a congregation of proselytes, converts, even after the lapse of many generations, unless his mother is Jewish by descent. This rule applies not only to the office of king, but also to any other office. One cannot serve as a captain of a host or even the superintendent of the distribution of water unless one is an Israelite by descent. As Scripture reads, 'You shall not be able to set over you a foreign man who is not your brother.' No woman is eligible to head the state, for Scripture reads melech, king, that is to say, not queen, malkah. So too, whatever the office to which appointment is made, only a man is qualified to hold it. The following may not be set up as king or high priest: a butcher, a barber, a bathhouse keeper, or a tanner, not because they are legally disqualified, but because their occupations are despised, and people will always have a low opinion of them. Therefore, one who is engaged even one day in any of these occupations is ineligible. Well, if the Bible is normative, then the modern rejection of monarchy is misguided and perverse, perhaps even sinful, and certainly bad public policy. On the one hand, according to Scripture and rabbinic interpretation, there is no ballot in the voting booth. Only God's choice of royal lineage based on exclusive qualifications linked to ethnicity, gender, and occupation. On the other hand, there's modernity's insistence on the will of the people, on representative government chosen by free elections, and on the admissibility of all persons to all public dignities, offices, and employments according to ability, with no other distinction than that of their virtues and talents. This disclosure of clash between pre-modern Judaism's social policies and modernity's ideals makes for uncomfortable, unwelcome cacophony. It is not what many audiences expect or want to hear. Revealing the contradiction between the egalitarian Universal Declaration and Judaism's discriminatory law of the divinely appointed king will exasperate the emancipated, assimilated, or integrated Rabbi Marvin Binders of modern American Judaism. It so infuriates Rabbi Binder that he's driven to slap the face of young Ozzie Friedman. Ozzie has the habit of aggravating Rabbi Binder with insolent questions that mercilessly expose the gaps in Rabbi Binder's thinking and reveal his pontificating hypocrisy. By bitter experience, Ozzie has learned that Rabbi Binder is vulnerable to the slightest intimation of disparity between traditional Judaism and American democracy. From an eyewitness, here's a first-hand report of their strained relationship. Quote, "What Ozzie wanted to know was always different. The first time he wanted to know how Rabbi Binder could call the Jews the chosen people if the Declaration of Independence declared all men to be equal." Well, allow me to explain. Oscar Friedman, known to his friends as Ozzie, is a 13-year-old boy, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Rabbi Binder, Ozzie's antagonist, is his Hebrew school teacher. Their names, Friedman versus Binder, suggest in good rabbinic midrashic fashion that they represent typologies and live only in narratives. Ozzie Friedman and Rabbi Binder are fictional characters. They play the starring roles in Philip Roth's gem of a short story, The Conversion of the Jews. I imagine that had Ozzie pressed Rabbi Binder to reconcile the Bible's anti-democratic law of the kings in the light of American practice and the egalitarian Universal Declaration, Rabbi Binder would have struck Ozzie in the face for a second time, this time more forcefully, perhaps breaking his nose rather than merely bloodying it. Philip Roth, however, is Philip Roth, an artist with transgressive passions and a wicked sense of humor. As for Ozzie Friedman and Rabbi Binder, they're only fictional characters. But what about the non-fictional world? What is the fate of Deuteronomy's royalist law in the hands of people who think of Judaism as the epitome of morality, who consider it axiomatic that Judaism is the timeless paragon of human rights, who find it altogether inconceivable that Judaism is not fully in accord with American political values, or that Judaism is not the venerable precursor inspiring modern civilization's most advanced and progressive system of ethics. Judaism and Human Rights is the title of a widely read and frequently cited of essays written by diverse scholars. It was edited by Milton Convitz, an expert in American civil rights law. It was first published in 1972 and reissued in an expanded second edition in 2001. The very first paragraph of the book's introduction remarks that, quote, "There is no word or phrase for human rights in the Hebrew Scriptures or in any other Jewish texts, nor is there in the Bible a word we would translate as conscience. Yet, as the essays in this book make clear, the absence of these and related words and phrases does not mean the non-existence of the ideals and values for which they stand or to which they point." To illustrate, to persuade us that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, to verify the claim that traditional Judaism cultivates human rights even if it lacks the exact terminology, Convitz directs our attention to the biblical law of kings. Invoking Scripture, he does not scold modern Western societies for displacing divinely ordained monarchy with egalitarian democracy, but he does credit Scripture's law of the king with providing all societies with an unsurpassed model of democracy at its best. The technical term for this sort of tour de force, this kind of argument, the one that defends religious traditions against all detractors and trumpets the superior virtues of religious traditions, is apologetics. Milton Convitz is an apologist. His argument on behalf of the biblical law of kings is bizarre. Its ethnocentric preening is as grandiose as its dislike of government interference with individual liberties is extravagant. Quote, "The essence of the democratic ideal, as the term is used in the free societies of the West, is a basic distrust of all government. A distrust of all government needs to be expressed in constitutional controls on the state and on all its agents and servants, in limits on the powers of government, so that ordinary citizens may be protected against violence, injustice, rapacity, and all forms of oppression and repression. Any sensitive reading of the Jewish tradition will show that the Bible left room for a king, but stressed that the king must only be the first among equals, and that he must be bound by the same law that binds all citizens. Deuteronomy 17, 18 through 20, so clearly and beautifully expresses the democratic spirit that it might well serve as the preamble to the constitution of any people who cherish the ideals of freedom and equality under the law. For evidence, Convitz cited the biblical text. Quote, "The king shall write for himself in a book, a copy of this code of laws, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren." His argument concludes with a final flourish of ethnocentric hyperbole. In all literature, it would be difficult to find another passage that so succinctly and forcefully expresses what is at the heart of the democratic ideal. But the passage is by no means unique in the Hebrew Bible or post-biblical literature. Convitz the apologist, couldn't be more mistaken about everything, except for the fact that there is no pre-modern Hebrew word for rights or conscience. It is painful, viscerally painful, to behold the lengths to which the apologist must go to suppress the evidence of conflict between modern ideals of Western democracy and the pre-modern Jewish tradition. Even more painful to watch their contorted efforts to credit pre-modern Jewish traditions with being the precursor to modern ethical norms. In his zeal to depict Judaism as a treasury of democratic ideals, Convitz blinded himself to Deuteronomy's emphatically theocratic insistence that it is God who chooses the king, but never a queen, and that the king must check his copying and studying of the book of the law with the priesthood, as we find in the first part of verse 18, which Convitz failed to quote. He shall write for himself a copy of this teaching in a book before the Levitical priests. This proviso hardly accords with the American principle of separation of church and state. Equally egregious in Convitz's panegyric are his misrepresentations of pre-modern monarchy and his apparent lack of familiarity with rabbinic law. Democratic, egalitarian societies can accommodate monarchy, but only if the royal family is restricted to ceremonial function and altogether and absolutely excluded from the legislative branch of elected government, in which case it would be true, as Convitz claimed, that the king must only be the first among equals. This arrangement is known as constitutional monarchy. Alas for Convitz's well-intentioned but ill-founded fantasies, constitutional monarchy is not what the biblical law prescribes. Biblical law says that the chief role of the king is not merely ceremonial, but actively to lead the armed forces in war and to subordinate all of society's resources to the conduct of its military affairs. In addition to his wartime responsibilities and powers, the king is also endowed with considerable legislative power. A sample of his powers listed by Maimonides in the 12th century law code includes the following kingly prerogatives. Quote, "The king is empowered to put to death anyone who rebels against him. So too if one reviles the king or taunts him, the king is empowered to condemn him to death. Also, with respect to the kings of Israel, in contrast to the kings of descending from the house of David, the rabbis enacted that the kings may neither judge nor be judged, neither testify nor be testified against, because they are arrogant, and if they were treated as commoners, the cause of religion would suffer." In other words, the king can't be brought to justice, nor can the king be involved in the process of the courts. Also, if a king kills another and there's no clear evidence, or if no warning had been given him, or if there was only one witness, all three of them being the prerequisites in rabbinic law for capital offenses, there must be clear, unambiguous, unequivocal evidence. There must be at least two eyewitnesses, and there must be a warning given to the perpetrator. Do you know that the act that you're about to commit is sinful, and the punishment for it is X, Y, and Z? The perpetrator must say, "Yep, I know all about it, and I'm going to do it anyway." These are the safeguards in rabbinic law. A king, however, doesn't need to abide by these procedures. The king may, if the exigency of the hour demands it, put him to death in order to ensure the stability of the social order. That's the escape clause. if there's a national emergency, the king can do whatever he wants to destroy people's liberties and freedom in the name of emergency salvation of the people. Also, it is within the province of the king to levy taxes upon the people for his own needs or for war purposes. He fixes the custom duties, and it is forbidden to evade them. Finally, the king may seize fields, olive yards, vineyards, and give them to his servants, and all the land that he conquers belongs to him. He may give thereof to his servants and warriors as much as he wishes. He may keep thereof for himself as much as he wishes. In all these matters, he is the final arbiter. All this hardly qualifies as the workings of constitutional monarchy. Apologists, however, are renowned for their ingenuity and their tenacity. They don't give up easily. Forced to concede that Judaism's law of the king may not accord with the egalitarian morality enshrined in the Universal Declaration, the apologists know that not all is lost. They can circle their wagons around Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman treatment and punishment, and find its parallels, if not its precursors, in rabbinic law. Verdicts of guilt, as we already learned from the law of kings, entail procedural safeguards. The alleged perpetrator of the crime must have been explicitly warned that the act about to be committed is forbidden and subject to such and such a penalty. The perpetrator must acknowledge his awareness. And finally, the act itself must have been directly observed by two credible, valid witnesses, eyewitnesses. Hearsay evidence is not admissible, and neither is a confession of guilt. In Jewish law, self-incrimination, either voluntary or involuntary, is disallowed. It carries no legal weight. No incentive, therefore, exists to force confessions of guilt, either voluntary or involuntary, by torture or any other means. Among the biblical foundations for this cluster of laws is Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, again in Robert Alter's translation. By the word of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall the one who dies be put to death. You shall not be put to death by the word of 1 witness. While never satisfied with pronouncing a law without supplying it with a rationale, medieval rabbinic authorities did not neglect the prohibition against torture and cruel punishments. Once again, Maimonides' Code of the Law, the Mishnah Torah. Quote, if one ties up another and leaves him in the cold or in the heat until he dies, or if one builds an enclosed space around another and deprives him of air, or if one puts another into a cave or a room and fills it with smoke so that he dies, in each of these cases, the offender must be put to death on the victim's account, inasmuch as he himself is deemed to have directly suffocated the victim. Regarding the insistence on valid witnesses and the refusal to rely on self-incriminating confession, Maimonides wrote this astonishing, stunning analysis. Quote, it is a scriptural decree, Gezerat HaKatuv, divine decree, scriptural decree, that the court shall not put a person to death or flog him on his own admission of guilt. This is done only on the evidence of 2 witnesses, for it is possible that the defendant was confused in mind when he made the confession. Perhaps he was one of those who are in misery, bitter in soul, who long for death. Perhaps that's the reason that prompted him to confess to a crime he did not commit in order that he be put to death. To sum up the matter, the principle that no person is to be declared guilty on his own admission is a divine decree. Perhaps then in the final analysis, on the question of torture, as in all the other overlaps between Jewish criminal law and modern regulations protective of civil liberties, there is no pragmatic difference between rabbinic ideals and the Universal Declaration. No documents are more suffused with acknowledgement of divine presence and divine will than the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature. And no document is more conscientiously bereft of the slightest allusion to anything transcendent, whether a personal deity, nature itself, or some impersonal cosmic force, than the thoroughly secular Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is difficult, impossible, to conjure two more radically opposed ideologies. The one saturated with its God, the other content with silence about ultimate things. Yet they nevertheless agree on seeking justice, establishing courts of law, and prohibiting torture. The profound difference between the secular legal system that recognizes self-incrimination and the Jewish system that refuses to recognize it because of a scriptural decree ends up being a difference that doesn't matter at all from a pragmatic point of view. The difference between the systems remain, but it dissolves into superficiality, the sort of thing that only an academic would bring up. The story is told that at one of the early United Nations discussions of human rights, someone expressed astonishment that certain champions of violently opposed ideologies had agreed to a list of those rights. Yes, they said, we agree about the rights, but on condition that no one asks us why. That why, Jacques Maritain, the French existentialist and involved in the UNESCO Committee of Philosophers, which advised the drafting committee, said, the why is where the arguments begin. This anecdote helps explain why the language of the Universal Declaration is non-committal regarding the ultimate why of things. Unlike America's Declaration of Independence, which reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The United Nations Universal Declaration pragmatically makes do in Article 1 with a very spare and baldly dogmatic, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Missing in action, or AWOL, from the Universal Declaration are appeals to the epistemology of self-evident truths and invocations of a Creator whose providential care and authority underwrite humanity's inalienable rights. Had the United Nations Drafting Committee included phrases like self-evident truths and Creator, had they dared display a preference for one ideological, philosophical, or religious system over all the many other and diverse cultures represented in the United Nations, some of them militantly atheistic, some capitalist, some communist, the consensus necessary for ratification would never have been achieved. To avoid arguments, to win consensus, it was diplomatically necessary to appear neutral by avoiding the why of things, precisely as it was pragmatically necessary to restrict the Universal Declaration to the rhetoric of exhortation. avoiding the terminology of duty, obligation, and legal binding force if ratification was to be achieved. The authors of the Universal Declaration almost succeeded in concealing their deepest philosophic convictions. In the preamble, invoking widely shared and therefore politically neutral values, they uninhibitedly announced their hopes of preventing a repetition of barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, of eliminating violent rebellion against tyranny and oppression, and of promoting the development of friendly relations between nations. No reason to conceal that. Barely discernible, the preamble also reveals, however, an unmistakable ideological preoccupation with individual persons rather than with the groups, organizations, and societies, collectivities, to which the individuals belong, in which they participate, and from which they derive their values, practices, and ways of life. The origins of this ideological predilection for the individual was traced by some observers and advisors working in the United Nations while the Universal Declaration was being drafted to two historical events. Quote, the Reformation, with its appeal to the absolute authority of individual conscience, and secondly, the rise of capitalism, with its emphasis on freedom of individual enterprise from the shackles of church and state. Though despite its authors' reluctance to divulge their ideological preference for individualism, their deeply held convictions proved irrepressible. The preamble mentions all members of the human family, the man, who is not to be compelled to have recourse to rebellion, the dignity and worth of the human person. Article 1 refers to all human beings, and Article 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on, all the way through the document, refers to every one and all. Article 16 is exceptional. It specifies a group, albeit the smallest, most intimate, and closest to the solitary, private, egocentric individual. Quote, the family is the natural and fundamental unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. Article 29 is also exceptional and particularly telling. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. This is the only appearance in the entire document of the word duty. And even then, the duty turns out to be not responsibility or obligation for the welfare of others, but a means toward narcissistic self-perfection. The ultimate purpose of the vague notion of community apparently being restricted in significance to the location that enables the free and full development of personality. In sum, the Universal Declaration shies away from the ultimate why. It anchors its political philosophy in the bedrock of concern for the welfare of individuals and couches its utopian vision in terms of immunities and entitlements rather than duties, obligations, and responsibilities. Parenthetically, I should say that one of the great monuments of medieval Hebrew literature, written at the second half of the 11th century in Saragossa by a rabbi named Bachya ibn Pakuda, written originally in Arabic Hidayah il Fara'id al-Qulub, translated into Hebrew as Sefer Chovot Halvavot, the book of duties of the heart. Duties, responsibilities, obligations, close parentheses. Nothing would be more unintelligible and unacceptable to medieval Jewish thinkers engaged in political philosophy than this modern combination of shying away from the ultimate why, this undervaluing of the discipline of obedience to law, and third, the favoring of individuals over collective welfare. Nothing. Not the preference for hedonistic democracy over the stability of monarchy. Not its obtuse acceptance of self-incrimination in criminal law. Perhaps not even its egalitarian treatment of men and women. Nothing in the Universal Declaration ratified by the United Nations would so trouble medieval Jewish scholars than this tripart combination of an adequate engagement with the ultimate why, inadequate respect for obedience to the law, and inadequate recognition of humanity's socio-political essence. From Al-Farabi, late 9th century, early 10th century Islamic philosopher. From Abu Nasr al-Farabi and all the other Islamic scholars who transmitted the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus into Islam and Judaism, especially the political philosophy of Plato, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides learned to think that the question of what makes a human being good, or what is the good for an individual human being, cannot be answered unless it is first known what constitutes the best, most noble, most virtuous society, excellent city, or ideal state. The most excellent society, in contrast to all the inferior ones, is the political regime described by Plato in the Republic, revisited in the Laws and in other dialogues, and subsequently explored by Aristotle in his Politics and Nicomachean Ethics. It is Al-Farabi who needs to be credited in the history of Western thought with recovering the political dimension of Plato and replacing his political preoccupations with the spiritual transcendentalism that Plato came to be known by in the Middle Ages. Plato was primarily a philosophical, political thinker, not a transcendentalist. And it's Al-Farabi who brought the politics of philosophy back into the heart of the two societies which were most fertile for understanding religion primarily in political terms, Islam and Judaism. So twice, in Maimonides' philosophic classic, The Guide of the Perplexed, we encounter the anthem of political thought as it was played in medieval Islamic and Jewish thought. In Book 2, Chapter 40, in the midst of an extended discussion of prophecy, in which, following the exact lead of Al-Farabi, Maimonides recast the biblical figure of the prophet in the image of the philosopher king described by Plato. We encounter this definition of the human species. Quote, "It has been explained with utmost clarity that man is political by nature, and that it is his nature to live in society. He is not like the other animals, for which society is not a necessity." And in Book 2, Chapter 27, in the midst of an extended discussion of law and its indispensable role in creating the ideal society, again explicitly following the lead of Al-Farabi, we encounter this explanation of the law: the most virtuous society and the ultimate why. Quote, "For the law as a whole aims at two things: the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. As for the welfare of the soul, It consists in the multitudes acquiring correct opinions. Not the individual, the multitude, the society as a whole. As for the welfare of the body, it comes about by the improvement of their ways of living with one another, including the abolition of their wronging one another, what we would call ethics. It has already been demonstrated that man has two perfections. The first perfection consists in being healthy and in being in the very best bodily state. And this is only possible through his finding the things necessary for him. These are his food, shelter, bathing, and so forth. This cannot be achieved in any way by an isolated individual, for an individual can only attain all this through a socio-political association, it already being known that man is political by nature. His ultimate perfection consists in knowing everything concerning all the beings that it is within his capacity to know. It is clear that this ultimate, most noble perfection can only be achieved after the first perfection, the welfare of the body, has been achieved. For man cannot represent to himself an abstract concept, come to understand, if he is in pain, or is very hungry, or is thirsty, or hot, or very cold. In such an Alfarabian or Maimonidean society, we can assume that the condition described in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration would be met, and that all parties concerned would understand the ultimate why. In an Alfarabian Maimonidean society, instead of reading, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, it would be written, everyone is obliged to provide everyone else with a standard of living adequate to life. One might be excused for thinking that in our non-Alfarabian, non-Maimonidean societies, like the ones presupposed in the Universal Declaration, no one would really understand the ultimate why of this right to an adequate standard of living. No one would be prepared to accept responsibility for providing it or acknowledging the political essence that makes us all so dependent on one another. In non-Maimonidean, non-Alfarabian societies, therefore, the basic needs of humanity's first perfection, the welfare of the body, would eventually be ignored. And the second perfection, the knowledge of the truth of things, would recede ever further away every day. Maimonides also thought that there was a hierarchy of perfection in talented and gifted individuals. Sometimes it happens, Maimonides wrote, that, quote, a force renders a person perfect, but has no other effect. Sometimes, on the other hand, the force overflows from rendering him perfect toward rendering others perfect. This distinction, too, this preference for the welfare of others over the welfare of the self, seems to have been lost in the non-Maimonidean societies presupposed by the Universal Declaration of 1948. This conclusion prompts an historical fantasy, a note on which to end. What would Maimonides, Al-Farabi, and their like-minded philosophers in Judaism and Islam have done were they somehow to find themselves official delegates in Paris in December 1948, when the General Assembly voted on the Universal Declaration? I think they would have voted with the nations that abstained. time for a few questions.
Please.
Happy to take them.
You can handle your own questions. Audiences.
From the last point, I happen to be aware that the Geneva Convention had their origin in the deliberation of the Russian aristocracy to contend with guerrilla warfare in Galicia in the late 17th century. And so there they are again among the nations who have been.
Yeah, politics are always involved in what we consider to be ethics. And I'm always reminded of that wonderful line by Walter Benjamin. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Yes, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Kalman. Insightful and entertaining as always. So Al-Farabi and Maimonides, if they were attending the conference in Paris, wouldn't they have also noticed that the economic structure under which they formulated their laws are no longer evident in the world in which they are living? Hence, they would have to do some ijtihad, some kind of creative thinking. So that's the polemical question. But more substantive to your discursive overview of the medieval period, was there any term, category in Jewish philosophy for dignity? You said there's no term for rights. So there was duty, which you identified as fara'id.
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. There is a concept of kavod habriot, a dignity or honor of creatures. And it's a little bit abstract, but it gets translated into things like, how does one deal with a corpse in preparation for burial? So there's a way of treating the body with dignity. And that's what they mean by kavod habriot. It's expanded into modern thinking to more generic human rights kind of things to make it align with the modern view of something about human essence. But I'm not sure that that's how the rabbinic term functions. Kavod habriot means just decently dealing with corpses, not insulting somebody to their face or spreading rumors. Yeah. Now, as for the first one, I'm glad you asked it, because I think Al-Farabi and Maimonides would have been startled by the economic system. They would have recognized immediately that this capitalist thing is probably the reason why we degenerated. They also would have probably said something must have happened to religion along the way. We don't recognize all this talk about the individual. I think they would have been more stunned by the talk of the individual and no talk of society than they would have been by the economics. Then, that being smart, they would have said the economics and the philosophy of individualism must have something to do with each other. So we've got to undo this capitalism. Are there any ideologies around today which preserve the honor of the collective and which put the group before the individual and which say that capitalism is not the way to go? I don't mean to be so coy, but it's really quite an education to read the transcript of the debate between 47 and 48 on getting this thing passed. And Article 17, everyone has the right to own property as well as an association with others. The hardliners wanted everybody has the right to personal property. But there were people in the audience who represented a different economic view, whose view of democracy said that if you really want democracy, you can't have personal property. Get rid of that right for property. So they compromised. They dropped the word personal, and they left the word property, creating a vacuum. Okay, yeah. People belonging to the collective are the collective owners of everything in the state. That's what nationalization means. That's true democracy. If those people were clever enough to come up with a way of ijtihad of coming up with the reconciliation of traditional views with contemporary reality. I think Maimonides and Al-Farabi could have done it with one hand tied behind their back. Right? Well, let's see if there's anybody else. I'm running out of voice, Ray, so.
I think our preamble also has to do with happiness and
Oh, yeah.
property. But I want to ask, what are the implications for basic rights relating to privacy?
In what tradition, what culture, what time? There, in the Universal Declaration, there is a right for privacy.
I mean, the intrinsic nature of what is an intrusion from the government, from Amazon.com, from Google, from everyone. Basically,
I'm not responsible for modern society. Ask me about the medieval rabbinic law, and I can tell you what the answer is. I can't justify it.
What was the
Except
relative?
even the medievals knew that if there was a national emergency, the head of state does have the right to do extraordinary things, like invade the privacy, if it's going to be for the good of everybody. So it's an old idea that heads of state can temporarily suspend regulations for the general good. And that's an old idea. But beyond that, for the government, I can sort of understand why corporations gather metadata gathering. I'm not responsible for that. I can't answer that question. I don't even want to. Okay.
I think you all realize now why Dr. Bland, Kalman, has been one of my most distinguished teachers, and we have all learned from you at your feet. We thank you for this incredible presentation.